welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I have with me Charlotte Gauthier of Royal Holloway in the University of London. Charlotte's a historian of religious conflict and nationhood, and her subjects of research include the Crusades and their role in forming English identity. Thanks for being with us, Charlotte, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's very good to be here.
Now, you've recently edited a book entitled The Crusades and the Far Right in the 21st Century. So we're going to be talking about modern uses and misuses of the Crusades. But let's start, if we can, with the basics, by which I mean the actual historical Crusades. I imagine most of our listeners will have a vague idea of what the Crusades were, but perhaps you can set the scene by sketching out what England's role in the Crusades was.
Sure. This is a very big, many and varied question. So as many of your listeners will know, the Crusades are meant to have started in 1095 when Pope Urban II made a big speech at Clermont in France. Urban said that the Christians in the East, by which he meant the Byzantine Empire, which was very rapidly losing ground to the Seljuk Turks, needed the help of Western chivalry in order to defend Christendom, as it were, the Christian lands in the East. So quite a lot of people, by which we mean in the sort of tens to hundreds of thousands, depending on which chronicles you're actually looking at, did in fact march eastward overland through Byzantium and down into the Holy Land. There were English contingents, or I should say Norman contingents, that joined this merry band. Stephen of Blois, who was the husband of William the Conqueror's daughter, was among them, for example. England played a fairly prominent role in most of the First Crusades. For example, the Third Crusade obviously has Richard the Lionheart. Now, scholars have written, there is one particular scholar called Christopher Tyerman who has written a whole book on England and the Crusades. He argues that English participation sort of petered out in the early 15th century. My doctoral thesis ended up arguing that actually the Crusades continue to be very popular, prominent, playing a role in diplomacy into the 16th century and the reign of Henry VIII. I think you could actually make a very good argument for the Crusades being at the heart of policy until at least the reign of James I. So the Crusades, they do definitely last beyond 1291, which is when the Crusades have been historically thought to end, when the last European possessions in the Holy Land fall to the Muslim conquerors, as it were. But, of course, that's not actually the case.
So England did play quite a big role in the Crusades, but it was a role played in an international enterprise rather than a nationalistic thing. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you have in the 19th century this sort of resurgence of interest in the Third Crusade, especially with Richard the Lionheart, as this sort of idea of England's national time, you know, brave King Richard and all of that. And you see quite prominently crusading imagery and things like that being brought back in the Victorian era. And then, of course, you know, all the way through the First World War, for example, when, you know, Allenby marches into Jerusalem, there's this idea that the British are on crusade again. So the nationalist overtones and connotations are really a kind of a manufacturing of the 19th and early 20th century.
Well, that gets us into our main topic, of the modern use and misuse of the Crusades. Before we go any further in that direction, perhaps I could ask how you came to be working on this topic.
It can be a long and involved question. The sort of upshot of it is at Royal Holloway. There is a very prominent Crusades historian, Professor Jonathan Phillips, who's deeply interested in the history and memory of crusading. And it was in talking and collaborating with him that I first really got interested in the very, very modern uses of crusading. So this volume was meant to be the first of two planned volumes, the second of which was to talk about the modern political uses of crusading. But the only problem with that is when you have scholars who are supposed to write on Hungary and Brazil and especially Russia, people who do that tend to disappear, and we didn't want to create any martyrs. So the volume that we have is the one that we could do at least until this political situation in those countries, I pray, blows over.
Well, that just underlines, doesn't it, the modern political salience of this stuff. It can be quite dangerous, lethally dangerous. There's one chapter in the book that focuses on the gunman in New Zealand who carried out the mosque murders a few years ago, and he identified himself with one of the Crusader leaders. And I believe Anders Breivik in Norway likewise identified himself with the Knights Templar.
Yes. People have said to me, well, isn't this all just a sort of bit overheated? These people playing Crusader type video games, just leave them to their fun. I mean, fine, who doesn't like a bit of Crusader Kings too? That's fine. But when it tips over into very real world violence, people who are saying that they are Crusaders or saying that they are influenced by, it's not even the real Crusades, but this sort of reified vision of the Crusades and Christendom that it can, and it has tipped over into antisocial behavior and into genuine political violence. And so one of the things that we hoped to do with the volume is to point out that this is happening. And also in my introduction, I'm trying to sort of get us towards why this might be happening and why it is the Crusades so specifically that these people use as their inspiration.
Yes, and Crusader imagery can form part of mainstream political discourse, can't it? Outside the violent fringe. One of the chapters in the book is about how the Daily Express, which actually has a Crusader knight as an image on its masthead, used this sort of imagery to promote Brexit.
Indeed, yes. Everything's a crusade. It's not just Brexit, but it's Runway 3 Heathrow. I mean, it's everything that you could possibly imagine. If you don't like it and you want to put together a political campaign against it, the best thing to do to whip up fervor is to call it a crusade, because that brings with it connotations of the chivalry and nobility of the people who are joining in your push for whatever it is that you do or don't want. So they use the word because it brings that sort of raft of associations, very few of which actually would have been comprehensible whatever to the people who actually went on crusade in the Middle Ages. But as I say, since the 19th century, crusading has sort of built up this raft of associations, and that's very much what all of the people who invoke it want to bring along when they do in fact invoke the Crusades.
And I wonder what the most recent example of this use of Crusader imagery being deployed is. I wonder if during the riots last summer there was Crusader symbolism. Do you happen to know if that happened?
Definitely, I think the most prominent recent example is if you look just before the recent US presidential election, you have a number of people posting on Twitter saying, we're going to re-elect Donald Trump. This is a crusade to reclaim Christendom, to make sure that Christendom sort of holds strong and things like that. And so any kind of right-wing figure, somebody is going to invoke the Crusades in favor of them.
Okay. One interesting thing that comes out of the book is that in the United States, there's also the Civil War, which serves as a reference point for neo-Confederates, and that acts as the source of a warrior myth in a parallel way to how the Crusades do.
Yes, indeed. It's something that people call the lost cause, this sort of idea that the flower of Southern chivalry was lost, not defending slavery, they never say that, but defending the way of life and the civilization as it was in the South. And so the Crusades sort of bring overtones of chivalry, and that is sort of, mashed together, as it were, and you have groups like the Ku Klux Klan, for example. They festoon themselves with crosses and they get on horses and they are knights riding off to the Crusades. What they're actually doing is racist terrorism, but they wrap it in this sort of beautiful chivalric vision of days gone by.
Indeed. Indeed. And moving back to Britain and Europe, this glorification of the Crusades, you say that goes back to the 19th and 20th centuries, so it's a creation of the Imperial Age, is that right?
Yes, very much so. And one of the series editors for the series that this volume is in, Mike Horswell, he has some quite profound scholarship on the various ways that crusading is used in the 19th and early 20th centuries, essentially to paint the British Empire. It is used by the various sort of European continental imperial powers, but especially by the British Empire, to say that we're bringing civilization, we're bringing Christendom, we are going out to our benighted brothers in the same way that we think, we hope, possibly, that we know that Urban II said at Clermont, we are going out to help our benighted brethren. So all of this comes round again, and everything old is new again in the 19th century.
And the Crusader myth gets used, doesn't it, in intra-European conflicts. I believe that General Franco's side in the Spanish Civil War looked on, or presented, that war as a crusade.
Indeed, yes. Everyone wants to say that, they are the Crusaders fighting against the incursions of the evil, whoever it is. And especially in Spain, this Reconquista imagery, where the idea is, you're recapturing lost Spanish territory from the evil hordes. You can see why a dictator like Franco would want to sort of recruit that imagery for his side.
Yeah. And that makes a certain amount of sense if you're basing your ideology on specifically Catholic nationalism. But the Crusades are perhaps an odd thing for British nationalists to seize on, because they were papal and Catholic, as well as international, as we've said. And there are a lot of other militaristic episodes in British history to choose from, including episodes where British troops were fighting Muslims in imperial times. But the far right are much more likely to turn to the Crusaders, which seems a bit odd.
Yes, indeed. I think mainly because, to sort of put myself in their mindset for a moment, yes, you can have people who are inordinately proud of the British Empire, but that doesn't bring the sort of wave of nostalgia that this sort of idea of chivalry and the Middle Ages does. In the 19th and early 20th century, you have the arts and crafts movement and the pre-Raphaelites who are building up a sort of, mythological imagery for the Crusades. And so when you say the word Crusades, people really do think of Waterhouse, the Lady of Shalott, much more so than they think of the actual dusty marching overland to the Holy Land in 1098. So if you are going to invoke a myth, why not invoke the one that has the overtones of you as the sort of noble and virtuous knight?
And I suppose the Catholicism of the Crusades was safely in the past, so modern English and British people, for whom anti-Catholicism was central to their national identity, they could glorify the Crusades without associating the Catholic religious side of them with what was going on in their own day.
I think that's right. This sort of Catholicism is safely in the past. And actually, if you lionize a figure like Richard the Lionheart, for example, he is very much going to the Holy Land, doing his own thing, almost without reference to the Pope. So if you pick your figures or your characters very carefully, then you can sort of ignore the fact that the Crusades were sort of initially called by the papacy. It does also help that the Pope was one of the villains of the piece because he colluded to have Richard imprisoned on the way back from the Holy Land. So, if you really want to get into the anti-Catholicism, Richard is absolutely your man.
Okay. One of the issues that arises with this subject is the boundary between the use of history and its misuse or abuse. There's the question of when the political use of history crosses over into abuse. And one of the things that you say in the book is that you can draw a line when elements of medieval culture become genuinely disconnected from what their original meaning and context was. So on that basis, there is a distinction between the creative use of history and outright abuse.
Indeed. I was very careful to say, when you say misuse, does that not imply a kind of normative use, as it were, of history? And I think that normative use, in air quotes, is actually quite a lot broader than many people give it credit for. But when it does tip over into completely cutting off history from its actual roots in fact or anything that happened, and using it solely as a set of images or symbols in order to invoke the particular emotions or feelings or vibes, if you prefer, in order to forward some kind of political or social program, especially an antisocial or violent program, then I think it is fairly clear that you're talking about the misuse or the appropriation of history. One of the other things that I try to talk about is why particularly all of the people who invoke the Crusades seem to position themselves as part of a much broader or larger movement. So, for example, Brenton Tarrant, who was found guilty of shooting up mosques in New Zealand and killing 51 people, so far as we know, he was in fact a lone gunman with no ties to anyone at all. But when you read his manifesto, he's talking all about how he is part of a movement and he's just one of thousands and they're all going to reclaim Christendom together. And so the question is, what is it about these people that make them want to position themselves as one of a mass uprising?
Yeah, and this, it seems, is different from the normal, banal nationalistic use of history, because history is always used to create national identity, and it's used by nationalists. And you have British nationalists spinning myths about World War II, for example. But it seems that this is something different from that, and it's something that's more dishonest and also more dangerous.
Yes, I mean, at the very least, there is nothing good that you can say about the British National Party, but the only thing that I will say about their use of history is that there is at least possibly one grain of sand worth of kernel of truth in the jumping off point that they used to spin their World War II mythology. You know, there was genuinely a sense of national solidarity, for example, during World War II. Now, they try to play on that in various awful and nefarious ways. But the interesting thing about the folks that we talk about in this book is that there is not even a sort of kernel of a shred of a hope of a truth in there. They are just completely deracinated images and feelings that they have reified, that they have constructed into an edifice that is built on essentially nothing more than the pre-Raphaelite images plus video games plus whatever they may or may not have gained from playing Warhammer. None of it has any sort of root in something that you could point out that's genuine about the past. And that's, I think, what makes these people especially dangerous, because it's not a matter for scholarship to go back and point out and say to these people, well, you've got the history wrong. They don't care. The history is not what they're interested in. It's not actually what they're talking about. And so then the question becomes, what do you actually do with these people who are using something that they sort of manufacture to look like history, but is actually not amenable to any kind of historical, scholarly thinking at all?
It sounds like it's in the same category as Holocaust denial, although perhaps it's worse because Holocaust deniers often take great pains to give their writings the form and appearance of scholarship, whereas in this case it's just vibes and memes.
Indeed, yes, vibes and memes are definitely what it is. And again, the cynic might point out and say, well, you know, there's sort of vibes and memes of all sorts on the internet. And yes, that's absolutely true. But then let's point out that not only, you know, the sort of lone gunman type, but actually you have state actors who are writing what they say are historical essays, for example. But then you have those same state actors going, one step further and putting up posters in Lithuania talking about the victory over the Teutonic Knights at Tanval and saying, our great victory, meaning Russia's great victory over the Teutonic Knights, except Russia didn't exist in 1410, right? So this sort of idea of coming in and appropriating the crusading history of other countries and then using it to press a territorial claim over people, that is the next and much wider and bigger phase of this.
Yes, and it's not dissimilar from someone in New Zealand, or indeed someone in the American Deep South, drawing on this medieval European stock of images and symbols. It's so remote from the original context and so tenuous that it is just myth-making.
Indeed, myth-making is precisely what it is. But, you know, myths are not just something that stay in people's heads. Whether people realize it or not, the sort of stock of myths and beliefs that they have or that they allow into their heads really do come out in their actions. And so to chronicle these myths that are being made, which have precisely nothing to do with actual crusading or actual crusade scholarship, but yet they do have an effect, sometimes a terribly antisocial, violent, murderous effect in the world. And that's why it is important to study and to continue to study these types of myths.
Indeed. And this, of course, raises the question of what can be done to combat this kind of destructive myth-making. Education presumably comes into the picture. I should say that I wasn't taught about the Crusades at all when I was at school. So I suppose the question is, first of all, whether this sort of thing should be taught through the education system, and if so, how it should be taught.
Yes, and this is, I think, one of the most pressing things, especially as so much funding for humanities teaching at all levels of education is cut. What do you lose when you don't teach children about the Crusades, for example? And I think that they very much should be taught, because it's important to get out in front of the things that teenagers will then find on the internet. To have a dispassionate and factual account, a scholarly based account of what actually went on, I am hoping that it does something. And there is some evidence that it does quite a bit, actually, to inoculate people against this type of radicalization. Because you can't have people coming up to them online saying, well, I bet you were never taught about this thing. Well, here's the real sort of story of it. If people already have a factual basis of things that they have learned, they can say, oh yes, I have been taught about that, actually. So I think that the more you can teach well, educate well, put the information out there, that can only be for the good. But then also, I think that there is also a social sort of aspect of this. Why does this sort of idea that these otherwise lonely, mostly young men are completely cut off from society, and so a myth comes along that they can be part of a mass movement and they can be chivalrous and virtuous and they can be sort of deeply connected into a family, as it were, that's stretching all back into the past? You can see why that kind of myth is so incredibly attractive, especially for young men who are not necessarily having a great time in modern society. Emile Durkheim wrote about this at the turn of the last century, right? We all know what happened within the first sort of 15 years of the beginning of the last century. Not saying that history will definitely repeat itself, but this sort of idea of young people, especially young men, experiencing this anomie, this sort of disconnection from society, and looking for a myth that they can really invest themselves in. Understanding why such things are so attractive to them, and then doing something actually to reach out to them or to better their social circumstances, I think is also another part of inoculating them against these pernicious myths.
Yes, and this I assume is a large part of the constituency that buys into this sort of thing. And I can see how it might be seductive if you're a disaffected young man. Who wants to be an internet troll sitting in their bedroom when you can be a Crusader knight?
Exactly. Precisely.
And there's also, as well as education, there's the broader dimension of popular culture. Because I don't think I can recall any popular TV series being made about the Crusades, certainly not in the last few years. They're not that visible in popular culture. Is it then the case that in some sense they've been left on the table for the far right to pick up?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the last sort of series that I can think of, I think there was something on the Templars. It was about 10 years ago or something like that. I think I saw one episode and it wasn't very good. And so, as you say, the idea, the Crusades and the idea of crusading, because it's kind of out of the mainstream, it is left for people who then want to sort of prey on it and to prey on the mainly young people who become sucked into this subculture. So the more we can do to try to, say, make the study of the Crusades more mainstream and not something that's only done by, quite frankly, far-right weirdos. All of the scholars that I know, none of them are far-right weirdos, but there are only about 200 or 250 of us in the world. So getting out in front of young people and talking about the genuine stuff, the genuine history of the Crusades is so much more interesting and vibrant than any of this sort of far-right stuff. You know, just like when that movie, Kingdom of Heaven came out, I think it was in just after the US invasion of Iraq. The actual story of that is so much more interesting than the movie makes it out to be. But you can see how 20 years, God help us, after that movie was made, what are the memes that these sort of far-right Crusader bros tend to use now? They're mostly, was it Ed Norton in a mask as Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, talking in these kind of, Zen cones, as it were. So if that is the sort of cultural artifact that we leave people with, they are going to build their sort of own myths on that type of stuff. Which is why, for example, Professor Phillips and some of us are trying to get out into schools to actually talk to real live children and young people about the Crusades and share how fascinating they actually are, so that 5 years, 10 years down the line or whatever, they are not coming across the Crusades for the first time, on the dark web, as it were.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that there was that kind of initiative of going into schools and talking to kids about all this. It'd be interesting to know what the kids think about it, particularly Muslim kids. Has there been any feedback on that?
Yes, and actually this is really fascinating. So the feedback that I most often get when I'm talking to sort of, young people, teenage or early university age, about the Crusades and talking about the motivation that the Crusaders had for going out. Obviously, some of them just went out because they want to smash things, kill people, and get money. But quite a lot of them actually are going because there is this sort of genuine idea that they are defending their brothers and sisters in the East, etc. And the feedback that I have very often gotten from the Muslim kids is, thank you for talking about religion as a motivation for this happening. Because going to secular schools or even going to, your normal Church of England, nominally faith, but really actually not a faith school, religion is so little talked about as a motivation for anyone doing anything in history that actually you can't grasp why anyone would do anything that they did, especially sort of in the Middle Ages, unless you talk about religion. And the sort of idea that there's now someone who has come in and talked to their class, even if it's just for half an hour, and they have mentioned, this is a force, this is a motivation. That really resonates with the children who come from a religious home, no matter what that religion is that they have at home, because that matches their worldview, their lived experience much more than the sort of entirely secular and rigidly secular education that they tend to get in schools.
That's a very interesting point. And conversely, there must be a leap of imagination needed from kids, and for that matter from adults, who are coming from a modern secular background, because we can understand the motives of someone who becomes a crusader because they're a bit of a thug, or indeed because they want to earn a wage. But the idea that you're trying to get an indulgence from the Pope, the idea that the fate of your immortal soul hangs on this and you're trying to get to heaven, that must be pretty remote to someone who's coming from a secular perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I find that it's a really good way to teach kids empathy. Weirdly enough, when you think about the Crusades, like empathy is the last thing that you think about, right? But actually, conversely, to try to put kids in the mindset, or even adults, to try to put them in the mindset of people who really, truly did believe that they were doing something for God and for their fellow human beings that was noble and virtuous, etc., even though we don't believe it mostly in the modern secular West. But just trying to get into that mindset, I think, is a useful exercise in empathy.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and this seems like a good point at which to end. Thank you very much for this illuminating discussion, Charlotte Gauthier. This is clearly a fascinating subject, one that's important and also somewhat disturbing, and it's one that certainly ought to be better understood. Thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much for having me.